Greetings, viewer. Don't forget to visit my website for links to support the production of these works if you value what I'm doing. I appreciate any help you can offer. Thank you for having a look and a listen. Yours, John Loth. The Evolution of Civilizations by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 5. Continued. Every civilization, indeed every society, begins with a mixture of two or more cultures. Such mixture of cultures is very common. In fact, it occurs at the boundaries of all cultures to some extent. But such casual cultural mixture is of little significance unless there comes into existence in the zone of mixture a new culture, arising from the mixture but different from the constituent parts. The process is a little like the way in which a mixture of chemicals sometimes produces a new compound, different from the mixing chemicals. In the case we are discussing, the new compound is a new society with a new culture. The contributing societies may be civilizations or merely producing societies, agricultural or pastoral, or merely parasitic societies, with hunting or fishing. Of the millions of cases of such cultural mixture that are occurring all the time, only rarely does there appear a new society. And even more rarely does this new society become organized in such a way that it is a producing society with an instrument of expansion. In the rare case where this occurs, we have the first stage of a new civilization. The fact that there have been no more than 24 civilizations in almost 10,000 years of cultural mixture of producing societies will indicate how rare this occurrence is. Since cultural mixture occurs on the borders of societies, civilizations rarely succeed one another in the same geographic area, but undergo a displacement in space. The process may be described somewhat as follows. Within a society, people have little choice as to the ways in which they will satisfy basic needs or fulfill their potentialities. If they are hungry, they eat the food their associates eat, prepared in the fashion customarily used in their society. If they wish companionship or a picture of their relationship to the universe or a relationship to God, or security, or shelter, or sex, or children, or whatever they may wish, they obtain these desires largely in the ways and forms provided by their own society. But on the borders of societies, there is a considerable mutual interpenetration of social customs, and there arise, accordingly, alternative ways of satisfying human needs. This is obviously particularly true where intermarriage occurs, and where decisions must be taken and choices made as to which customs will be followed. Such choices are imperative in regard to bringing up the children of mixed marriages. When this occurs far enough inside the border of a society for there to be a social majority and consensus, there is no real choice, and if any effort is made to make a choice, the children themselves will preempt for the local consensus. But in an area of fairly equal mixture, or in an area of unequal mixture, where the majority culture is declining and decreasing in prestige, a very real need to make choices arises. These choices in themselves are not very significant in forming a new culture, but two other considerations are important. In the first place, the many choices being made must be morphologically compatible in order to give rise to the necessary amount of integration to permit a body of social custom to arise. And in the second place, a certain number of families in the same locality must make the same or similar choices. In this way, a new society may arise. If this society is productive, and if it becomes organized so that it has an instrument of expansion, a new civilization will be born. As a consequence of these conditions, civilizations have generally arisen on the periphery of earlier civilizations. Canaanite, Hittite, and Minoan civilizations arise on the edges of Mesopotamian civilization. Classical civilization was born on the shores of the Aegean Sea, especially the eastern shore, on what was the periphery of Minoan civilization. Western civilization arose in Western Europe, especially in France, which was a periphery of classical civilization. And on other peripheries of classical civilization were born Russian civilization and Islamic civilization. If the new society born from such mixture is a civilization, it has an instrument of expansion. This means that inventions begin to be made, surplus begins to be accumulated, and this surplus begins to be used to utilize new inventions. Eventually, as a result of these actions, expansion will begin. The interval before such expansion becomes evident, but after the most obvious mixture has ceased, may cover generations of time. This period will be called the stage of gestation. It is stage 2 of any civilization. In general, it is a period in which the society seems to be changing very little, and most people seem to have fairly stable status situations in the social structure. But, under the surface, much of importance is taking place, and, above all, the process of investment and invention that will make possible the following period of expansion is taking place. The stage of expansion is marked by 4 kinds of expansion. A. Increased production of goods, eventually reflected in rising standards of living. B. Increase in population of the society, generally because of a declining death rate. C. An increase in the geographic extent of the civilization, for this is a period of exploration and colonization. And D. An increase in knowledge. There are intimate interrelationships among these 4. Increase in production is aided by expanding knowledge. The growth of a population helps to increase production, as well as to extend the geographic area of the society. The exploration and colonization associated with this extension of the society's geographic area is made possible by the growth of production and the growth of population, both of which permit people to be released for what are, at the beginning at least, non-productive activities, such as exploration. The same factors allow people to be released to seek knowledge of various kinds, or to engage in non-material activities, such as artistic or philosophical activities, while the geographic expansion in itself leads to substantial increases in knowledge. This period of expansion is frequently a period of democracy, of scientific advance, and of revolutionary political change, as the various levels of society become adapted to an expanding mode of life from the more static mode of life prevalent in stage 2. As a result of the geographic expansion of the society, it comes to be divided into 2 areas: the core area, which the civilization occupied at the end of stage 2, and the peripheral area, into which it expanded during stage 3. The core area of Mesopotamian civilization was the lower valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The peripheral area was the highlands surrounding this valley and more remote areas like Iran, Syria, and Anatolia. The core area of Minoan civilization was the island of Crete. Its peripheral area included the Aegean Islands and the Balkan coast. The core area of classical civilization was the shores of the Aegean Sea. Its peripheral areas were the whole Mediterranean seacoast and ultimately Spain, North Africa, and Gaul. The core area of Western civilization covered northern Italy, most of France, the Low Countries, England, and extreme western Germany. Its peripheral areas included the rest of Europe to eastern Poland, North and South America, and Australia. When expansion begins to slow up in the core areas, as a result of the instrument of expansion becoming institutionalized, and the core area becomes increasingly static and legalistic, the peripheral areas continue to expand by what is essentially a process of geographic circumvention, and frequently shortcut many of the developments experienced by the core area. As a result, by the latter half of Stage 3, the peripheral areas are tending to become wealthier and more powerful than the core areas. Another way of saying this is that the core area tends to pass from Stage 3 to Stage 4 earlier than do the peripheral areas. In time, the instrument of expansion becomes an institution throughout the society. Investment begins to decrease, and the rate of expansion, although not expansion itself, begins to decline. As soon as the rate of expansion in a civilization begins to decline noticeably, it enters Stage 4, the Age of Conflict. This is probably the most complex, most interesting, and most critical of all the 7 stages. It is marked by 4 chief characteristics. A. It is a period of declining rate of expansion. B. It is a period of growing tension of evolution and increasing class conflicts, especially in the core area. C. It is a period of increasingly frequent and increasingly violent imperialist wars. And D. It is a period of growing irrationality, pessimism, superstitions, and otherworldliness. The declining rate of expansion is caused by the institutionalization of the instrument of expansion. The growing class conflicts arise from the increasing tension of evolution, from the obvious conflict of interests between a society adapted to expansion and the vested interests controlling the uninvested surpluses of the institution of expansion, who fear social change more than anything else. Usually, there is a majority of the frustrated struggling against the minority of vested interests, although usually neither side has any clear idea of the real issues at stake or what would give a workable solution to the crises. All programs for sharing the surplus of the few among the discontented many are worse than useless, since expansion can be resumed only if the 3 necessary elements of an instrument of expansion are provided, and the dissipation of surpluses among a large mass of consumers will not provide any one of these 3 necessary elements. On the contrary, most revolutionary programs, aroused by the failure of the 3rd element, investment, will merely make the crisis more acute by destroying the 2nd element, accumulation of surplus. The only sensible or workable solution to the crises of the civilization would be to reform or circumvent the old institution of expansion by establishing again the 3 basic elements of any instrument of expansion. Since the disgruntled masses know nothing about such things, and since the vested interests do not know much more and are usually concentrating their energies on an effort to defend their vested interests, a new instrument of expansion, if it appears, usually does so by accident and through the path of circumvention rather than by reform. If a new instrument of expansion does come into existence, the civilization begins to expand again. The tension of evolution and the crises subside, and the civilization is once again in Stage 3. The Age of Conflict, Stage 4, is a period of imperialist wars and of irrationality, supported for reasons that are usually different in the different social classes. The masses of the people, who have no vested interest in the existing institution of expansion, engage in imperialist wars because it seems the only way to overcome the slowing down of expansion. Unable to get ahead by other means, such as economic means, they seek to get ahead by political action, above all, by taking wealth from their political neighbors. At the same time, they turn to irrationality to compensate for the growing insecurity of life, for the chronic economic depression, for the growing bitterness and dangers of class struggles, for the growing social disruption and insecurity from imperialist wars. This is generally a period of gambling, use of narcotics or intoxicants, obsession with sex, frequently as perversion, increasing crime, growing numbers of neurotics and psychotics, growing obsession with death, and with the hereafter. The vested interests encourage the growth of imperialist wars and irrationality because both serve to divert the discontent of the masses away from their vested interests, the uninvested surplus. Accordingly, some of the defenders of vested interests divert a certain part of their surplus to create instruments of class oppression, instruments of imperialist wars, and instruments of irrationality. Once these instruments are created and begin to become institutions of class oppression, of imperialist wars, and of irrationality, the chances of the institution of expansion being reformed into an instrument of expansion become almost nil. These three new vested interests, in combination with the older vested institution of expansion, are in a position to prevent all reform. The last of these three, the old institution of expansion, now begins to lose its privileges and advantages to the three institutions it has financed. Of these three, the institution of class oppression controls much of the political power of the society. The institution of imperialist wars controls much of the military power of the society, and the institution of irrationality controls much of the intellectual life of the society. These three, which may be combined into only two or one, become dominant, and the group that formerly controlled the institution of expansion falls back into a secondary role, its surpluses largely absorbed by its own creations. In this way, in Mesopotamian civilization, the Sumerian priesthood, which had been the original instrument of expansion, fell into a secondary role behind the secular kings it had set up to command its armies in the imperialist wars of its age of conflict. In the same way, in classical civilization, the slave-owning landlords, who had been the original instrument of expansion, were largely eclipsed by the mercenary army that had been created to carry on the imperialist wars of the age of conflict, but took on a life and purpose of its own and came to dominate classical civilization completely. So, too, the Nazi Party, which had been financed by some of the German monopoly capitalists as an instrument of class oppression, of imperialist war, and of irrationality, took on purposes of its own and began to dominate the monopoly capitalists for its own ends. As a result of the imperialist wars of the age of conflict, the number of political units in the civilization is reduced. Eventually, one unit emerges triumphant. When this occurs, we are in stage 5, the stage of universal empire. Just as the core area passes from stage 3 to stage 4, earlier than the peripheral area does, so the core area comes to be conquered by a single state before the whole civilization is conquered by the universal empire. In Mesopotamia, the core area was conquered by Babylonia as early as 1700 BC, but the whole civilization was not conquered by a universal empire until Assyria about 725 BC, replaced by Persia about 525 BC. In classical civilization, the core area was conquered by Macedonia about 330 BC. The whole civilization was conquered by Rome about 146 BC. Western civilization has gone from stage 3 to stage 4 3 different times. The 3 ages of conflict are A. The period of the 100 Years' War, say 1300 to 1430, B. The period of the Second 100 Years' War, say 1650 to 1815, and C. The period of war crises that began about 1900 and still continues. In each case, the core was conquered by an imperialist state, by England under Henry V, about 1420, by France under Napoleon, about 1810, and by Germany under Hitler, about 1942. In the first 2 cases, the old institution of expansion, chivalry, and mercantilism was circumvented by a new instrument of expansion, commercial capitalism and industrial capitalism, and a new period of expansion commenced. In the third case, it is too early to see what has happened. We may be getting a new instrument of expansion that will circumvent monopoly capitalism and bring our civilization once again into a period of expansion. Or we may continue in the age of conflict until the whole of our civilization comes to be dominated by a single state, probably the United States. In the imperialist wars of stage 4 of a civilization, the more peripheral states are consistently victorious over less peripheral states. In Mesopotamian civilization, the core states like Uruk, Kish, Ur, Nippur, and Lagash were conquered by more peripheral states like Agad and Babylon. These in turn were conquered by peripheral Assyria, and the whole of Western Asia was ultimately conquered by fully peripheral Persia. In Minoan civilization, the core area of Crete itself seems to have been conquered by peripheral Mycenae. In classical civilization, the core area, Ionian states, led by Athens, were conquered by the semi-peripheral Dorian states, Sparta and Thebes, and the whole Greek-speaking world was then conquered by more peripheral Macedonia. Ultimately, the whole of classical civilization was conquered by fully peripheral Rome. In the New World, the two isolated maize civilizations seem to provide a similar pattern. In Mesoamerica, the core Mayan cities of Yucatan and Guatemala seem to have been overcome by the semi-peripheral Toltecs, and these in turn by the fully peripheral Aztecs of highland Mexico. In the Andes region, the core area seems to have been along the coast and in the northern highlands of Peru. These cultures were submerged by a number of more peripheral cultures, of which the most successful was the Tiahuanaco, from the southern highlands of Peru. And finally, at a late date, not a century before Pizarro, the whole Andean civilization was conquered by the fully peripheral Incas from the forbidding central highlands. In the Far East and Middle East, the same sequence can be discerned. The core area of Sinic civilization was in the Huanghe Valley. This area was conquered by Zhou about 1000 BC and by semi-peripheral Xian from the mountains of Shenxi 8 centuries later, 221 BC. The whole of Sinic society was then brought into a single universal empire by the Han dynasty from its southern periphery, 202 BC to AD 220. The Sinic civilization was destroyed by Hunnish nomad invaders before AD 400, and a new civilization, which we call Chinese, began to rise from the wreckage along its southern frontier. The core of this society seems to have been south of the Yangtze River. This core came under a single political rule as early as 700, under the Tang dynasty. Wider areas were added by successive dynasties, of which the Yuan, or Mongols, were so remote that they can be regarded neither as peripheral nor even as Chinese, 1260 to 1368. The Ming, 1368 to 1644, were of southern Chinese, and thus peripheral. The Ming, 1368 to 1644, were of southern Chinese, and thus peripheral origin. And the final universal empire of the Manchu, 1644 to 1912, was from the peripheral north, Manchuria, with its original seat of power at Mukden. The history of the Middle East provides similar evidence. We cannot speak with any assurance about the Indic civilization, but it seems likely that its earliest origins were in the lower valley, Sind, and are to be seen in the excavations at Chandudaro, while later it moved northward into the Punjab, upper valley, and found its universal empire in the originally peripheral Harappa area. After the destruction of this culture by the Aryan invaders from the northwest, the successor Hindu civilization began to arise, late 2nd millennium BC, in the Ganges Valley. The core area of this new civilization fell under the political control of the local Maurya, ca. 540 to 184 BC, and Gupta, ca. 320 to 535 dynasties. Then, as Hindu culture spread over the whole Indian subcontinent, political dominance shifted to peripheral powers, such as the Gujara Pratihara dynasty, ca. 740 to 1036, originating from Central Asiatic pastoral invaders, and a series of Muslim dynasties, mostly Turkish, at Delhi, after 1266, culminating in the universal empire of the Mughals, 1526 to 1857. In the Islamic civilization, a similar pattern seems to have occurred. The core area of this civilization is to be found in Western Arabia. As its culture spread over most of Western Asia and Northern Africa, political domination fell to increasingly peripheral dynasties. The Umayyad Caliphate, of Arabic origin, ruled from Damascus during much of its period, 661 to 750, while its successor, the Abbasid Caliphate, ruled from Baghdad, 750 ca. to 930. The Seljuk Turks ruled briefly, 1050 to 1110, from Persia, and were ultimately succeeded by the universal empire of the Ottoman Turks, with its center in Anatolia, 1300 to 1922. The victory of more peripheral states over less peripheral states during stage 4 of any civilization seems so well established that it is worthwhile to seek the reasons for it. A number of these can be mentioned. In the first place, as a general rule, material culture diffuses more easily than non-material culture, so that peripheral areas tend to become more materialistic than less peripheral areas, while the latter spend much of their time, wealth, energy, and attention on religion, philosophy, art, or literature. The former spend a much greater portion of these resources on military, political, and economic matters. Therefore, peripheral areas are more likely to win victories. This contrast is quite clear between, let us say, Sumerians and Assyrians, between Ionians and Dorians, between Greeks and Latins, between Mayans and Aztecs, or even between Europeans and Americans. A second reason for the victories of more peripheral states arises from the fact that the process of evolution is slightly earlier in more central areas than in peripheral ones. Thus, the central areas have already passed on to stage 4, and may even have achieved a premature dress rehearsal of stage 5, with the achievement of a single core empire, while peripheral areas are still in a relatively vigorous stage 3. Generally speaking, military victory is more likely to go to an area or state in stage 3 than to one in any later stage, because the later stages and the more central areas are more harassed by class conflicts and are more paralyzed by the inertia and obstruction of institutions. Core areas generally have been ravaged for a longer period of imperialist wars. The combination of these obstacles gives the inhabitants of a core area a kind of world weariness, sometimes called a failure of nerve, that is in sharp contrast to their own earlier attitudes or to those of their more peripheral rivals. Accordingly, the task of creating a universal empire is likely to be left to such rivals. It should be noted that in some cases, such as Egypt, Crete, or Russia, a single political unit has ruled over the civilization from its early history. This generally arises in civilizations whose instrument of expansion is a socialist state. In such a case, imperialist wars are not so prevalent, a characteristic of stage 4, and the achievement of a single political unit universal empire, is not one of the chief characteristics of that stage. As a result, the stage may last a shorter time and cannot be so easily demarcated from earlier and later stages as can be done in civilizations where imperialist war and achievement of a universal empire are two of the most prominent marks of the stage. Absence of these items does not indicate absence of the stage, which is marked by its other, less easily observed characteristics, such as decreasing rate of expansion, growing class conflicts, declining democracy, dying science, decreasing inventiveness, and growing irrationality. These characteristics, and the commonly observed achievement of political domination by a single peripheral state, bring the civilization to stage 5, the stage of universal empire. When a universal empire is established in a civilization, the society enters upon a golden age. At least this is what it seems to the periods that follow it. Such a golden age is a period of peace and of relative prosperity. Peace arises from the absence of any competing political units within the area of the civilization itself, and from the remoteness or even absence of struggles with other societies outside. Prosperity arises from the ending of internal belligerent destruction, the reduction of internal trade barriers, the establishment of a common system of weights, measures, and coinage, and from the extensive government spending associated with the establishment of a universal empire. But this appearance of prosperity is deceptive. Little real economic expansion is possible because no real instrument of expansion exists. New inventions are rare, and real economic investment is lacking. The vested interests have triumphed and are living off their capital, building unproductive and blatant monuments like the pyramids, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Colosseum, or, as premature examples, Hitler's Chancellery and the Victor Emmanuel Memorial. The masses of the people in such an empire live from the waste of these non-productive expenditures. The Golden Age is really the glow of overripeness, and soon decline begins. When it becomes evident, we pass from stage 5, universal empire, to stage 6, decay. The stage of decay is a period of acute economic depression, declining standards of living, civil wars between the various vested interests, and growing illiteracy. The society grows weaker and weaker. Vain efforts are made to stop the wastage by legislation. But the decline continues. The religious, intellectual, social, and political levels of the society begin to lose the allegiance of the masses, of the people on a large scale. New religious movements begin to sweep over the society. There is a growing reluctance to fight for the society or even to support it by paying taxes. This period of decay may last for a long time, but eventually the civilization can no longer defend itself, as Mesopotamia could not after 400 BC, as Egypt could not about the same time, as Crete could not after 1400 BC, as Rome could not after AD 350, as the Incas and Aztecs could not after 1500, as India could not after 1700, as China could not after 1830, and as Islam could not after 1850. Stage 7 is the stage of invasion, when the civilization, no longer able to defend itself because it is no longer willing to defend itself, lies wide open to barbarian invaders. These invaders are barbarians only in the sense that they are outsiders. Frequently, these outsiders are another, younger and more powerful civilization. The following list of universal empires shows the barbarian invader that destroyed the civilization in question. Civilization: Mesopotamian, Universal Empire. Persian. Invader. Greeks. Date 334 to 300 BC. Civilization. Egyptian. Universal Empire. Egyptian. Invader. Greeks. Date 334 to 300 BC. Civilization. Cretan. Universal Empire. Minoan. Invader. Greek tribes. 1400 to 1100 BC. Civilization. Canaanite. Universal Empire. Punic. Invader. Romans. Date 264 to 146 BC. Civilization. Classical. Universal Empire. Roman. Invader. Germanic tribes. Date 350 to 550. Civilization. Andean. Universal Empire. Inca. Invader. Spaniards. Date 1534 to 1550. Civilization. Mesoamerican. Universal Empire. Aztec. Invader. Spaniards. Date 1519 to 1550. Civilization. Chinese. Universal Empire. Manchu. Invader. Europeans. Date 1800 to 1930. Civilization. Hindu. Universal Empire. Mughal. Invader. Europeans. Date 1500 to 1945. Civilization. Islamic. Universal Empire. Ottoman. Invader. Europeans. Date 1770 to 1920. As a result of these invasions by an outside society, the civilization is destroyed and ceases to exist. This stage of invasion is also a period of mixture. As such, it may be, but does not need to be, stage 1 of a new civilization. This condition was true of several of the invasions listed above. The invasions of the Greek tribes, which ended Minoan civilization, marked stage 1 of classical civilization. The invasions of the Germanic tribes, which ended classical civilization, marked stage 1 of Western civilization. The 7 stages are merely a convenient way of dividing a complex historical process. This process is not relentlessly deterministic at all points, but merely at some points, in the sense that men have power and free will, but their actions have consequences nevertheless. In general, if cultural mixture produces a new producing society with an instrument of expansion, we have stage 1 of a civilization. Stages 2, 3, and 4 will follow inevitably. This means that if a producing society has an instrument of expansion, saving and investment will lead to expansion, and this expansion will eventually slow up as the instrument becomes an institution. At this point, in the early part of stage 4, there is considerable freedom since the institutionalized instrument of expansion may be reformed or circumvented. If it is, expansion will be resumed, and the civilization will again be in stage 3. If it is not reformed or circumvented, reaction will triumph, and the crises will become worse. The choice between reform and reaction is not, however, a rigid one. The last part of stage 3 may be a continual series of minor reforms and circumventions to the point where the creation of new instruments just about balances the institutionalization of old instruments, and expansion continues at a fair rate for a considerable time. Circumvention, especially geographic circumvention, may force institutions that would not otherwise have reformed to do so in order to compete. Thus, for example, as the textile industry of New England became institutionalized, New, more modern plants grew up in the south. The existence of these southern plants, a case of geographic circumvention, forced the textile mills of New England either to modernize or to perish. On a more dramatic scale, the whole industrial system of England in recent times has been in an institutionalized condition and has been faced with the choice of reforming, thus creating new economic activities and new economic organizations, or perishing from the competition of peripheral areas like the United States, or semi-peripheral areas like Germany, or even other civilizations like Japan or India. Because of such conditions as these, the whole first part of the Age of Conflict, Stage 4, is a period of crises and of hope. Only when the vested interests create new instruments of class oppression, of imperialist wars, and of irrationality, and when these new instruments in turn begin to become institutions, does hope fade. Crisis becomes endemic in the civilization and continues until the universal empire with its golden age is established. In those civilizations that had a single political unit from an earlier stage, like Egyptian, Minoan, or Orthodox civilization, the age of conflict is frequently of briefer duration because imperialist wars are of limited extent. The fact that these one-state civilizations frequently have a socialist state as their instrument of expansion also serves to obscure the duration of the age of conflict, because such a civilization has weak incentives to invent in its age of expansion, and less dramatic class conflicts in its age of conflict, thus serving to obscure the transition from one of these stages to the other. In theory, there is nothing rigid about Stage 5. So far as observations of past civilizations indicate, every civilization passes from the age of conflict to the age of universal empire. That means that one state, probably a peripheral one, emerges triumphant over the whole area of the civilization. But in theory, it is at least conceivable that the competing states of Stage 4 might just fight each other down and down to lower and lower levels of prosperity and public order, without one emerging triumphant over all the others. In such a case, Stage 5 might be omitted, and the civilization would pass directly from Stage 4 to Stage 6, conflict to decay, without achieving any universal empire. Something like this may have been true of Mesoamerican civilization. In a similar way, it is conceivable, in theory, that a civilization could continue for a very long time in the stage of decay without passing on to Stage 7, for there can be no invasion to end the civilization unless there are invaders to come in. Egypt, for example, was so well protected by seas and deserts against invaders that its stage of decay lasted for more than 1,000 years. It is also, in theory, conceivable that some universal empire someday might cover the whole globe, leaving no external barbarians to serve as invaders. This point leads to one final consideration, namely, the relationship of outside societies to any civilization. In theory, again, it would seem that an outside society that was stronger than a given civilization might at any time come in and smash it. In practice, however, it seems that civilizations are in little danger of such an experience except early or late in their careers. In general, a civilization is in no danger from any society except another civilization from Stage 2 to Stage 6. In Stage 6, however, it is in danger from any society, even a parasitic one, as is clear from the destruction of Cretan, Classical, Hittite, and Cynic civilizations by non-civilized invaders. When two civilizations collide, we may use the tentative rule that the victory will go to the one that is closer to Stage 3, expansion, but that neither one will be destroyed unless it is in Stage 6. In 492 to 479 BC, classical civilization in Stage 3 and Mesopotamian civilization in the last part of stage 5 collided, and the former won. In 336 to 323, they collided again, with classical in stage 4 and Mesopotamian in stage 6, and the latter was destroyed. In 264 to 146 BC, classical civilization in stage 4 met Canaanite civilization in stage 6 and destroyed it. In 711 to 814, Western civilization in stage 2 was able to preserve itself against Islamic civilization in stage 3. 300 years later, in what we call the Crusades, Western civilization in stage 3 returned the visit to Islamic civilization, then in stage 4, but could not destroy it. However, in 1850 to 1920, Western civilization, just reaching the end of stage 3, again collided with Islamic civilization, now in stage 6, and destroyed its universal empire, the Ottoman Empire, and probably liquidated the whole civilization, a process that is still going on. This was only one of several civilizations that were in a similar stage, and that have met or appear to be now meeting a similar fate. The other universal empires in stage 6 that have been destroyed by Western civilization while in stage 3 are the Inca, the Aztec, the Manchu, the Mughal in India, and perhaps the Tokugawa in Japan. At the present time, India seems to be in stage 2 of a new civilization. China may be in stage 1 of a new civilization, while the situation in Japan and the Near East is still too chaotic to make any judgment about what is happening. Russian civilization, which began about AD 500 and had its period of expansion about 1500 to 1900, had the state as its instrument of expansion and was just entering upon stage 4 in 1917, when the reform of this institution gave it a new instrument of expansion. As a result, Russian civilization has been in stage 3 for the second time in recent years, but it remains a relatively weak civilization because of its weak incentives to invention. A collision between this civilization, which is early in stage 3, and Western civilization, which has just begun stage 4, would probably be indecisive in its outcome. If Western civilization reforms and again passes into stage 3, it will be far too powerful to be defeated by Russian civilization. If Western civilization does not reform, but continues through the stage of conflict into the stage of universal empire, that threat from Russian civilization will be much greater. However, by that time, the new Indian civilization or the new Chinese civilization may be in stage 3 and will present greater threats to both Western and Russian civilizations than either of these will present to the other. The possible, but by no means inevitable relationships of these 4 civilizations in terms of the relevant stages can be seen from the following chart. Civilization, Western, present time, stage 4, future, stage 5, and remote future, stage 6. Civilization, Russian, present time, stage 3, future, stage 4, remote future, stage 5. Civilization, Indian, 2, present time, stage 2, future, stage 3, remote future, not available. Civilization, Chinese 2, present time, stage 1 or 2, future, stage 3, remote future, not available. This chart is purely guesswork because of Western civilization reforms in the present time, as appears highly likely, or if any revolutionary new technological discovery, such as the conquest of photosynthesis, is made in the near future, this whole relationship will be modified. Returning from the unknown future to the partially known past, we can conclude this chapter by a chart that gives, in a rough fashion, the chronology of the 7 stages for the civilizations with which we shall be most concerned. If you enjoyed this recording, You can find more and support the production of these works at my website, johnlothe.wordpress.com. That's www.johnlothe.wordpress.com. Thanks for having a look and a listen. Your friend, John Lothe.